San Diego Remembers, sponsored by Home Federal and by the San Diego County Honda dealers.
When the factory has shipped you 1,000 Hondas in every model and color and says, sell them, there's only one thing left to do. See how fast you can make them go. Race to your authorized San Diego County Honda dealer today before a great deal on a Honda passes you by. 1,000 beautiful new Hondas on sale now and moving fast.
Some things you expect to pay for. Some things you don't. Some you do. Some you don't. If you haven't already noticed, your bank may be charging you for your own money at your own ATM. But at Home Fed, we don't. Home Federal. Free. Anytime.
They came from McDonald's. They came in a Happy Meal. They were McDonald's new food changeables. In the hands of your innocent children, hotcakes become Robo Cakes. French fries become Fry-Bot. 8 different new food changeables, 2 each week, 1 with each Happy Meal. New food changeables. Collect all 8.
September 7th, 1940, nearly 1,000 German bombers struck at the heart of London. The London Blitz had begun.
All of a sudden, out of nowhere, there's this one hell of an explosion. No one realized what it was until we were informed the following day that it was a rocket.
Today, across from this little park in London, not far from Buckingham Palace, is a giant government building. What the Germans did not know was that the British had fortified the basement of that building. It is now known as the Cabinet War Room. Today it is a museum, and behind the locked doors in the basement is a time capsule of history.
During the bombing of London, Winston Churchill and his cabinet were forced to go underground into this room. This is the cabinet room. It is here that Sir Winston would sit.
Winston Churchill lived in this bunker. A special telephone line was installed in early 1941, so he could have instant contact with President Franklin Roosevelt in Washington. And the BBC set up a broadcast studio so Churchill could talk on the radio to his fellow countrymen. For Churchill and his war cabinet, this underground bunker became their home away from home. In short, it was where the war in Britain was controlled. All of the British activities were plotted and planned here in this underground bunker.
That if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
In the early 1940s, Nazi bombers used to use the Thames River as a navigational guide to find their way here to the heart of London. Their targets were many of the buildings just over my shoulder.
At night during this period, all of England had to be blacked out, so enemy planes could not make out the landscape. In a London pub, Peter Lloyd, a former member of the Royal Navy, remembers those nightly blackouts well.
I mean, you walk into lampposts now, you do that because you're drunk. You walked in the lamppost then because you didn't know the damn things were there.
Today, London has rebuilt, but still many Londoners remember those dark days of World War II.
Ken Foster, now a cabbie in London, was 12 years old during the Blitz. For him, it was an exciting and at the same time, a frightening experience.
Well, especially when you heard the sirens go and you heard all the German, of the night time, and you heard all the German bombers coming over. you know, and you used to have to get, like as I say, some people had Anderson shelters, which they went out in their garden, and some people lived in the tube stations. They used to go down the tubes. One day we was playing out in the streets, and it was a cloudy day, and all of a sudden we heard this German plane, well, we heard a plane coming over, and this German bomber came underneath the clouds and started to machine gun the streets, and we all had to dive in the hedges to get out of the way. You know, it was frightening, but then I suppose for kids it was a little bit of excitement as well.
I don't think they were ever afraid. They were angry, very angry.
But by early 1944, England was not being bombed every night. Something else was going on. Men, ships, planes, and supplies were being massed at hundreds of locations around the British Isle. All of those supplies were for the invasion of Europe, the turning point of World War II.
So while London continued to be bombed, hostilities were building in the Pacific. And soon San Diego, like the rest of the country, would be involved in World War II.
Ironically, it was not the action in Europe, but Japan, which forced the United States into the war. On Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, planes from 6 Japanese carriers flew over Oahu, and then just before 8 o'clock in the morning, on to Pearl Harbor. On that lazy Sunday morning, most of the Pacific Fleet was in port. It would later be reported the ships were sitting ducks. By 10 in the morning, 6 of the 8 battleships in Pearl Harbor were sunk or badly damaged. The Oklahoma had capsized. The Arizona was on fire and sinking. Half of the aircraft on the island were wrecked. Some 2,400 men had died. 1,200 more were seriously injured. The only bright spot was the Navy's 3 carriers were not at Pearl Harbor on that morning. The next morning, December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed Congress and declared war on Japan. With the Pearl Harbor attack, the war became a world war. And in San Diego, the build-up for war took on a new importance. As the world went to war in 1941, San Diego was a sleepy little border town that was about to wake up, and it would never quite be the same again. Glenn Miller's music filled the air, and talk of the war was on everyone's lips. This was Balboa Park in the early 1940s. Oh yes, that dirt road below the park is now Highway 163. The population in San Diego was just over 100,000, and the average price of a 3-bedroom home, if you could find one, was about $6,500. I say if you could find one because, like everything else during the war years, there was a housing shortage. Everything was in short supply. For instance, we all wanted sugar. At local restaurants, people did this. Well, sugar was hard to find. This was Navy Pier during the war. It's now part of the Embarcadero. Then it was a restricted area because just down the street was the 11th District Naval Headquarters, where strategies of the war in the Pacific were being planned. Now, almost 50 years later, Don Brackman remembers this area during the war years.
I came down, my troop ship was tied up here. It had poured down rain the 21st of August, so we went over to the Santa Fe depot and said our goodbyes there, and then I came back over and got aboard my troop ship, and Pat sat in her office and watched the troop ship go off to Guam.
Don, tell me what it was like on Broadway during those war years.
But I remember the old streetcars, the bumpy streetcars that used to come down Fifth Avenue, and then they turned around right in front of the Santa Fe depot, and fares were a nickel at that time. I think if you went out to Pacific Beach, it may have cost you a dime. But the streetcars were one right after the other, and the military was 2 after 2, I guess. It was just a great crowd.
So, during the war years, the principal mode of travel in San Diego was the trolley. With bells clanging and metal wheels screeching, they could be heard all over the city as they bounced and rumbled along. This is downtown San Diego in 1942, and you have probably noticed there aren't very many trucks or cars on the street. That's because gasoline and tires were rationed and in very short supply. All of these stores along the street here cater to the men and women of the armed forces. But like everything else these days, merchandise is limited. Oh, look over there. Marston's has a sale on nylons. Someone once observed the fighting was almost as fierce for nylons as in the war zones of the Pacific and Europe. It was then a major victory to get a pair of nylons. And in 1942, our forces overseas were beginning to turn the corner after Pearl Harbor, and we were beginning to claim victories of our own.
But not all was victory. There was the Bataan Death March, and we will talk with a survivor as San Diego remembers the war years.
Just $94.30. $94.30 for Jeep Wrangler. The American legend. Jeep Wrangler. $94.30. With the highest resale value in its class. A great deal now, a great deal more later.
Now at your California Jeep Eagle dealer, where you can expect the best from the best.
It's another summer of fun at Kentucky Fried Chicken. Get the Hot Time Special for just $6.99. Yeah, 9 pieces of chicken for just $6.99. While you're there, pick up your free Summer of Fun theme park discount booklet while supplies last. Cross the road to the Hot Time Special. 9 pieces of chicken, just $6.99.
Lucky wants you to know there is a difference between USDA Select and USDA Choice beef. Select, lean and tasty. Choice, flavorful. Select, lower in calories. Choice, juicy. Select, lower in fat. Choice, exceptionally tender. And what do both these great grades of beef have in common? You'll find them both only at Lucky, still the low price leader.
I'm Pat Brown at Cush Acura, and with me is Kathy Trujillo, proud owner of a brand new Acura Integra. Kathy, do you love it?
I love it.
I thought so. Why'd you come to Cush?
I was referred to them by friends for their great service and the nice cars.
What about the service?
They were very nice. Excellent service. They made me feel right at home.
Would you come back to Cush?
Yes, definitely.
Come to Cush. Kathy did.
Count on us to keep you moving. Come to Cush.
In March of 1942, President Roosevelt ordered Douglas MacArthur to leave the Philippines. He escaped in a PT boat under the cover of night. A month later, in what would be called the worst defeat in U.S. history, 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers surrendered to the Japanese. They surrendered on a peninsula south of Manila, known as Bataan. Now, 46 years later, in an office in the VA building in Mission Valley, Mel Madero, a survivor of Bataan, volunteers his time, and he remembers.
Our last orders we got from Wainwright to destroy everything, and that's what we did. We destroyed everything and walked down into Marvelas, and the Japanese forces were so upset with us for destroying all of the equipment. They said, well, we have no way to transport you to O'Donnell, Camp O'Donnell, which was the first prison camp. So you walk it, and this is how the so-called Bataan Death March started.
The Japanese would march their prisoners 56 miles with little food and no water. If a prisoner fell to the ground, he was killed. 10,000 men would die in the march to the prisoner of war camp. So how did Mel Madero make it through the march?
I wanted to survive. And the other thing kept me going was that I had a buddy with me.
As Bataan fell, back here in California, a roundup of Japanese Americans began. Later, it would be called the worst violation of civil rights America had ever seen. Japanese Americans who had businesses or property lost it, and they were held for the duration of the war in internment camps like this one in Central California.
I went through San Diego High School, San Diego State, and graduated from Berkeley, from the University of California. Finally, the orders came through that we were to move out of San Diego in April of 1942. It was a very traumatic experience for the simple reason that the ruling was that we would only take one suitcase per person. And we had a son that was about 8 months old, and to carry all the baggages for the baby was very, very difficult.
Most of these people would never recover their losses.
Many of them lost everything. And so there are still a number of people who are quite bitter about the thing, but I might say that we were on the fortunate side.
The shooting has started, and history has recorded who fired the first shot. In the long run, however, all that will matter is who fired the last shot.
In 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt visited aircraft plants in San Diego. His goal was to build morale. But the workers here didn't need a lot of encouragement because they were already working in double shifts and turning out a new airplane every hour. This is San Diegan Bill Channa. In 1943, he was a flight engineer at Consolidated Aircraft. Today, he has total recall of those days during the war.
We had a concern and fear of attacks similar to Pearl Harbor, and so we had all of these balloons hanging up, tethered balloons to stop that. And of course, already they had, right as soon as that Pearl Harbor attack, we started camouflaging the whole area around the plant with chicken wire and chicken feathers and so on. And it was a very effective thing because I remember in our flight tests that if you were directly over the airport at Lindbergh Field, you didn't know you were over an airport.
Bill's co-worker was Fred Zellmer. This is how he looked in 1943. He recalls how Consolidated borrowed guns from its planes for protection at night.
Well, the only real security we had, and the only 50 caliber machine guns in this area were on bailment to Convair. And when we were flying for firing tests, the 50 calibers were on the XB-24B. And as soon as we landed, they were dismantled from the XB and given to the Marines on the rooftops.
San Diego's contribution to the war in terms of manufacturing was very important. But in those days, Bill Channa remembers it was hard to find defense workers.
Oh yes, there were many men and women, and Rosie the Riveter, as is commonly known, was out there doing the maintenance and also the assembly work on B-24s, PB-Ys, PB-2Y3s, and so on.
In the beginning, women were not welcome in defense plants. You see, some supervisors said that their clothing fit them too tightly and created problems for their male co-workers. Well, those problems were quickly worked out, and the women went to work. In fact, they even wrote a song for these more attractive defense workers.
All the day long, where the rain or shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the riveter, when they gave her a production knee, she was as proud as a girl could be. There's something true about red, white, and blue about Rosie, the riveter.
When Rosie wasn't working, she might have watched movie stars like Jimmy Cagney or Abbott and Costello, who came to San Diego to sell war bonds. One day in 1943, Kate Smith sold $40 million worth of bonds herself. All of that money went into the war effort in hopes of bringing Americans home soon.
We've had some grand trips, but it's been wonderful. I'm very thrilled to be here. I really have nothing new to report from the States. You know, the States, that's where Churchill lives.
It is early June 1944. In England, American, British, Canadian, and the Free French troops have been massing men and equipment in a project called Operation Overlord. Their one unified goal is to invade and to hold the continent of Europe that is currently under the grip of the Nazis. To ensure the success of Operation Overlord, the exact location of the landing on French soil has been kept secret. Only General Eisenhower and his top commanders know the Allied forces will land on the beaches of Normandy.
Nobody came out and told us. We knew something was going to happen, but not that it was going to be the invasion of Normandy or the invasion of Europe.
Troops who were veterans of many earlier campaigns were now anxious, waiting in barracks and on ships for the order to invade Europe. These troops had honed their skills to a sharp edge. But the waiting was long. The equipment was in place and ready for transport. The men had trained and then trained some more. All was in readiness, except for one thing, the weather. Some of the worst storms in 20 years were lashing out at the English Channel, creating conditions quite impossible to transport nearly 1 million men and equipment to France. As commanders waited for a break in the weather, troops were kept on board hundreds of ships, ready to move at a moment's notice.
I boarded LCT 594 on June the 1st. It was in the Dart River, loaded with the amphibious Sherman tank, which was top secret. I'll tell you frankly, everybody was just scared. I'm a Catholic. I had my beads, incidentally, while I'm going along here. I had my beads out saying prayers. Everybody was praying.
Finally, at 3:30 on the afternoon of June 5th, 1944, General Eisenhower gave the order that the invasion was on for that night. Later that afternoon, Ike went to several of the staging areas in Britain. He talked to American troops. He would later say it was very difficult to look into the eyes of the men that he was sending into battle, knowing full well many would never return. Across the English Channel, along the French shoreline, the German troops were preparing for the invasion they knew would someday come. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the German officer in charge of the French beaches, told his troops the coastline must be held at all costs. Rommel knew if the invading forces got beyond the beaches, the Germans were in trouble. The Germans had fortified Normandy, but they thought the attack would come at Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel, where they were concentrating their defenses. That became a costly mistake for the Germans.
It was here at Pointe du Hoc on that June 6th that the Nazi observers, as the fog lifted, first saw the Allied fleet.
Myself, I landed in the third wave, but we were just assault teams with more ammunition to supplement the troops that had already made the landing on the beachhead.
It was D-Day, June 6, 1944. It was the beginning of the liberation of Europe. Off the shore from the Normandy beaches were 6,000 ships and boats, hundreds of thousands of men, and 1 million tons of equipment.
I was looking out the door, and I saw these white lines that were looked like millions of white lines. I had no idea what they were. Got a little lighter, and then you could see the invasion ships, and that's what it was. It was the wake from the ships, it was really something to experience.
General Eisenhower had gambled the weather would clear long enough to get his troops across the English Channel. He won. He also gambled that by invading Normandy, the attack would come as a surprise to the Germans, and it did. It was the largest naval, air, and land force ever assembled. The British, the Canadians, and the Free French landed on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. The American forces took the furthest and the most difficult of the beaches, Omaha and Utah.
I wondered where the Germans were. How could you get that many vessels in such a narrow area? Remember, that channel where we were is only about 60 miles across at that point. This is not the vast Pacific Ocean. Where were the Germans?
The enemy was there, but after the Navy bombardment had ended, the shock of the invasion had set in, and the German troops counterattacked.
As one walks along Omaha Beach, you can still see the bombed-out remains of Nazi gun emplacements in the hills. On June 6, 1944, Oscar Romero, a San Diegan, was 20 years old. He landed right here along this beach. He remembers that morning vividly.
I remember jumping off, and I don't know how deep the water was, but it was over my head, and I had this Bangalore torpedoes on me, my rifle, canister of machine gun 30 caliber ammunition, and a section of Bangalore torpedo. Well, when I hit the bottom, I dropped everything. Okay, I dropped everything, and I came out, and all I had was my rifle, but it wouldn't fire because it was full of sand and water and what have you, you know.
Oscar Romero fought his way up the Normandy beach. And not long after that landing, a Signal Corps photographer snapped this picture of Oscar. It appeared in the National Geographic magazine in 1944. Oscar remembers those days 45 years later.
When the artillery started, I just hit the ground with the rest of the guys, and there was this fellow laying there, you know. So I thought, hey, buddy, I says, let's go. I says, we're going to get killed out here. No, he was already dead.
It was a victory for the Allied forces, but it was a costly victory. On this June 6th, and for the next 10 days, 23,386 Americans would lose their lives. Today, just above Omaha Beach, is the American Cemetery and Memorial to those who fought and died here. When the beaches of Normandy were finally secured, the battle was not yet finished. Next came the villages and the surrounding countryside, and the push to Paris.
San Diego Remembers will continue.
When the factory has shipped you 1,000 Hondas in every model and color and says, sell them, there's only one thing left to do. See how fast you can make them go. Race to your authorized San Diego County Honda dealer today before a great deal on a Honda passes you by. 1,000 beautiful new Hondas on sale now and moving fast.
Most banks pay you jumbo interest if you deposit a ton of money. But what about smaller amounts? At Home Federal, we won't treat them like peanuts. We pay big interest starting at $20,000. And the higher your balance, the higher the interest. Home Federal. Don't forget.
It's allergy time again, when little things can cause big misery. It's time to get the big relief of Dimetap Extend Tabs, the 12-hour allergy medicine. Dimetap is recommended millions of times by doctors and pharmacists. Dimetap, it gets things back to normal.
Honey, the school called again today.
Again?
Tommy's out of control. He's disrupting the class.
He's just a kid. Don't they think he'll calm down?
They think we should have him tested.
I'll talk to him. But shouldn't we give him more time? See what happens.
If your child needs help, call Charter Hospital of San Diego.
The jukebox was a staple of World War II. When San Diegans weren't working in the defense plants or training to be sailors and Marines, they were dancing to the sounds of a jukebox or a big band. Carmen Dunn was a high school senior in 1942 and remembers her first visit to the San Diego USO.
My sister and I went down with 2 or 3 other girls, driven by the lady that had asked us to go down. I mean, they took us and brought us back. I don't think I sat down all of that night. I had several proposals, but I couldn't even walk the next day. I tell you, and you know, in those days, we danced all the time.
During the war years, this is how the campus of Our Lady of Peace High School in East San Diego looked. Today, 46 years later, Mrs. Dunn and I walked that same path at the school, and she remembered the war years.
As a year or 2 went on, and you really realized that, what were you going to do that night? Where was anybody? I mean, and in my days, you went out usually double dating.
For young women like Mrs. Dunn, those early years of the war saw the men of her age taken away to fight. And for those women left at home, the radio was their link to what was going on in the war zones. And this song was for them.
There is a too young or too old. There is a too gray or too grassy green.
The young and the old went to the movies during the war years in greater numbers. During this period, movies did their biggest business in history. Lines like this one at the Old California Theater in downtown San Diego were always long, and the movies were light and frivolous to take our minds off the war. And there was always a short subject telling us to buy war bonds.
Buy a bond, and by, the bonds you buy will bring you victory. Buy a bond, and you'll be standing by the victory arch when Johnny comes marching home again. Oh, you.
The money from the sale of those bonds would pay for the war effort. And it was a greater effort than ever before as the fighting became more fierce, both in the Pacific and in Europe. Though there were still snipers above the beaches at Normandy, American forces began to make their way inland from the sea. West of Utah Beach at Normandy was the village of St. Mary Église. It was an important crossroads for supplying the German forces. Hours before the beach landing at Normandy, American and British paratroopers and infantrymen in gliders landed in the rural countryside behind the beach gun emplacements.
Off and that.
San Diegan Keith Manfull was one of those glider pilots. He still today keeps a model of the kind of glider he flew in 45 years ago.
The landings weren't as successful as they had been planned to be due to the fact that the Germans knew we were coming, and they had put big 6-foot logs in our landing fields and that, so that made it awful hard to land. And in landing, if you ran into one of them, why, of course, it tore up the glider pretty badly. And of course, some of the people got injured doing it, and others were successful. We knew it was, in a sense, kind of a do-or-die type of thing.
Behind the gliders came the paratroopers. Shortly before 3:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the 82nd Airborne Division dropped in on the village of St. Mary Église. But as Martin Finkelstein tells us, not all of those paratroopers landed where they were supposed to.
As we were coming into the coast of France, I saw this long white line, which was the waves breaking on the seashore. I knew that, and we went into a cloud bank. And when we came out of the cloud bank, the plane on the left, his wingtip was almost in our door. Of course, our pilot went into a steep dive. When we went out, my chute opened and I was on the ground. And of course, we didn't find out till later. We were 20 miles inland, off our DZ. We found out that we were jumped right in the middle of a battalion of Germans on maneuvers. And 11 of us were trying to fight them. We eventually was captured.
A former member of the 82nd Airborne Division was Philippe Jataris. Today, he lives in the village of St. Mary Église, and he operates a small museum, a museum dedicated to the memory of those who fought here. He talked with us about that night 45 years ago, when American liberators dropped out of the sky.
The night drop on St. Mary Église was something beautiful. It was all, the sky was lit up, and all these paratroopers coming from the sky. It was fairyland. And, of course, local population didn't realize that there was going to be some fireworks after that.
St. Mary Église became the first village in Europe to be liberated. But it is most famous for the American paratrooper whose parachute caught on the corner of a church steeple in the heart of the city. The paratrooper hung there from his parachute on the side of the church, watching for several hours as his fellow soldiers were shot down by German troops as they landed in the city square. And today there is still a reminder of what happened on the side of the church steeple at St. Mary Église. Inland from the beaches of Normandy and the beautiful French countryside is the historic city of Caen. It has been an important city in France since the 10th century. It was the favorite city of William the Conqueror, and he built his castle here in 1099. The Nazis moved into Caen in 1942, as they did in all of France. Caen became a Nazi headquarters. The advancing British and the Americans knew the only way to secure the city of Caen was to get the Germans out, and they had to bomb it. The British radio broadcast of that first night of bombing tells the story.
Hundreds upon hundreds of pounds of bombs are raining down on this stricken town, and still the bombers come pouring in. There seems to be no end to them. This is an attack in a big way.
8 miles from the beaches of Normandy is the city of Caen. The Allied forces, as they invaded, bombed 75% of the buildings here. But some of the most historical, some of them dating back to the 10th century, were saved.
After and during those days of bombing, the people of Caen gathered at the cathedral, and they sought shelter. There were the young, and there were the old. Everyone who was displaced by war. The battle to liberate Caen took more than a month to win. The 16th century cathedral, which is still in use today, was not a target of the Allied bombs because large white crosses were painted on the rooftops. Caen has been rebuilt today, and it is a beautiful city. The cathedral is still there, still the centerpiece of Caen. In Paris, resistance fighters were setting up their own battle for freedom. Knowing the American and British forces were working their way toward the City of Light, the French resistance movement began to openly fight the Nazis in the streets of Paris. The Nazi commander in Paris had orders from Hitler to destroy the city. But before that happened, on August 25, 1944, a French armored division, followed by American forces, marched into Paris, and the Germans surrendered. The next day, Charles de Gaulle had his moment of triumph. He and the Free French returned to Paris. He marched up the Champs-Élysées to the Arc of Triomphe.
For hundreds of years, the Arc de Triomphe has ruled over the Champs-Élysées. And today it still stands as a memorial to the unknown soldier of France.
But in Paris, there were still 4 million people who needed food and the other necessities of life.
Though Paris had been liberated, the hardships in this city were great. San Diegan Dr. Harry Anthony remembers those hardships all too well.
The economy was in bad shape. The transportation system was very bad. There were a lot of shortages of different kinds of even foods. Just to give you an example, they could not bring even bananas from Africa. And to get a banana, you had to be a little kid or an elderly. And it was kind of tough.
The City of Light had survived. The museums that stood for centuries were intact. Art treasures that had become the pride of the French and admired by the world were once again in the hands of the Free French.
Paris is liberated. The Nazis are pushed back across the Seine River and out of Paris. And now the push by the Allied forces is on to Germany.
San Diego Remembers. We'll be right back.
With import prices going out of sight, it's time to take a stand. A stand for value, like this great new Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. Now, for the price of this Olds, you could buy about 4/5 of a Honda, 3/5 of this Nissan, ooh, less than 2/3 of a Toyota, ouch, or all of this beautiful new generation Oldsmobile. So take a stand, because when it comes to value, the imports just don't stand up.
This is the new generation of Olds.
You can open an interest checking account with no minimum balance at any of our convenient locations. Home Federal.
Just $94.30, $94.30 for Jeep Wrangler. The American legend. Jeep Wrangler, $94.30. With the highest resale value in its class. A great deal now, a great deal more later.
Now at your California Jeep Eagle dealer, where you can expect the best from the best.
Monday, the billion-dollar industry of counterfeiting exclusive merchandise, how they fight it and why it hurts consumers. I'm Bill Griffin.
I'm Laura Buxton. A new study focuses on how women love. We'll hear about it and see if it reflects our opinions. And a first-hand account of the Alaskan oil spill.
And I'm Jack White. West meets East. We're going to take you to the opening of the East Trolley Line, and we'll have all the late-breaking news.
Inside San Diego, Monday morning at 11 on San Diego's 10.
It's March of 1945. The German forces are on the run. As they move east, they are destroying every bridge that crosses the Rhine River. American and British commanders were looking for any way to get men and equipment across the river, but the choices were few. Then on the morning of March 7th, a detachment of Americans from the 9th Armored Division emerged from the Eifel Woods, and they were shocked to find a bridge still intact. But the German troops were getting ready to blow it up. Hitler had personally given orders that no bridge was to be left standing for the enemy to cross. But for some reason, the charges planted at Remagen do not knock the structure down.
This is what's left of the bridge at Remagen. In 1945, it was the last bridge to cross the Rhine River. General Eisenhower said that this bridge to the American forces was worth its weight in gold. And so, on March the 7th, 1945, American forces came right down here and took this bridge. One of the first to cross was a young 20-year-old lieutenant, Richard Swenson.
He would have been 21 years of age 3 months later. He was not quite 21 when he was killed, and it was quite a tragedy to our family.
Richard Swenson was one of 3 brothers who died in World War II. Swede Swenson, Richard's brother, lives in Del Mar. He has carefully retraced his younger brother's last days at Remagen.
Richard was in charge of a platoon, which I'm told was around 30 soldiers, and they were an advanced force that got into the town ahead of the supplies and ahead of most of the army, and they held the town for 4 or 5 days, and by the time that we could bring up reinforcements, the Germans had also realized that we had taken the town and knew it was a key point, and they sent a battalion across, which is approximately 1,000 guys, and the 30 trying to hold off 1,000. It just was impossible, and all the 30 in his regiment got killed.
And this is where Richard Swenson is buried, in the American cemetery in the Netherlands, along with 8,301 other Americans who died fighting in Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium.
By March of 1945, the people of the Netherlands had seen 4 long years of war. They were a grateful nation when liberation finally came, and they gave this land to the Americans as a memorial.
But a lot of people...
Albert Roding has adopted the grave of American Richard Swenson. Over the years, he has developed a friendship with Richard's brother and learned the story of the Swenson family. In his study, Roding keeps photographs of the Swenson brothers. Today, Roding brings flowers and cares for Richard's grave. But why?
Well, out of appreciation and the feelings towards the Americans that we have, you know, they liberated my parents. I'm born in '52, so you hear a lot. You grow up hearing stories. My parents told stories about the Americans and what they did and how they came into the village and that sort of things. So you grow up and you visit the cemetery sometimes. And I wanted to adopt a grave for somebody special.
The battle to take the last bridge on the Rhine River is well remembered today. And for many, those who fought to save the bridge are remembered as well.
On several occasions, German troops tried to blow up the bridge here at Remagen, but they failed in each attempt. American forces used the bridge for 10 days, and they took so much heavy equipment across the bridge that it just suddenly collapsed.
But the bridge towers still stand as a reminder of what happened here so many years ago.
Just before the American troops found the bridge at Remagen, this important meeting took place at Yalta. It would be the last time the Big Three would ever meet. That's President Roosevelt right over there.
In February of 1945, President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at Yalta to map out the occupation zones for the end of the war. Churchill would later say, President Roosevelt looked pale and drawn, as though life was fading away. 2 months later, on April 12th, President Roosevelt died. And a nation paid tribute to its 32nd president. In Europe, the U.S. Army made its first crossing of the Elbe River on the day of the president's death, and they were about 50 miles from Berlin. Hitler's propaganda minister was ecstatic at the news of Roosevelt's death, and he congratulated Hitler. He assured Hitler that this was the turning point for Germany. But American military momentum did not falter as the new commander-in-chief, Harry Truman, took over. But the Germans' most feared enemy, the Soviets, were moving in on the city. On April 25th, Berlin was besieged with Russian shells. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler ended his life. 2 days later, the Third Reich asked for a ceasefire. It was the Russians who first moved into Berlin. Outside of Berlin, American forces were taking prisoners. In the years between World War I and the mid-1930s, Berlin had been a cosmopolitan center of Europe, a center of commerce, a seat of learning, an energetic center of manufacturing. But now, in the wake of war, it was a city reduced to rubble and occupied by Russian communist troops, along with American and British forces. Even then, it was a divided city.
The city of Berlin is 752 years old. Most of the more magnificent buildings of this city were bombed during World War II, as was just about everything else. But today, West Berlin is rebuilding. It is a thriving and a busy metropolis. Even though West Berlin has been rebuilt, it is surrounded by a wall. Today, Berlin is two different cities, the communists in the east and the democratic form of government in the west. But at the end of the war, all the Allies were united on one idea. Nazism had to be quickly erased, and they started at the Reichstag building. This is the Reichstag today. It is a museum. In 1945, when the swastika was blown up, the war in Europe came to an end, but the fighting was continuing in the Pacific. Many troops were moved from Europe to the Pacific, but at 9:15 on the morning of August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki became the target of a second atomic bomb. A few days later, the Japanese surrendered. On September 2nd, on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the Japanese signed the instrument of capitulation, the document of surrender. It was over. The war to end all wars had ended. And it was time now for Americans to come home.
Sometimes life in the kitchen can get a bit dull. Starting today, it's going to get a lot more colorful. Introducing Reynolds Crystal Color Plastic Wrap. Brightens everything from leftovers to lunchboxes.
Green, amazing, yellow!
Reynolds Plastic Wrap in colors.
Blue,
very cool. Put some excitement back in your kitchen. Wrap it right and bright.
With import prices going out of sight, it's time to take a stand for value, like this great new Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. Now, for the price of this Olds, you could buy about 4/5 of a Honda, 3/5 of this Nissan, ooh, less than 2/3 of a Toyota, ouch, or all of this beautiful new generation Oldsmobile. So take a stand, because when it comes to value, the imports just don't stand up.
This is the new generation of Olds.
Most banks pay you jumbo interest if you deposit a ton of money. But what about smaller amounts? At Home Federal, we won't treat them like peanuts. We pay big interest starting at $20,000. And the higher your balance, the higher the interest. Home Federal. Don't forget.
San Diego Remembers, sponsored by Home Federal and by the Southern California Oldsmobile dealers.
For many people today, World War II is something in the past that they've only read about in history books. For that reason, we have taken the time to record some of the faces and the words of people who are our neighbors, who were there and were participants in that moment in history. We hope that by remembering their individual stories, there will be a new appreciation for what went on during that time. If we are truly a peace-loving people, then it is important to listen to what they say. It would be impossible to show and talk about each event in the 2,194 days of World War II. We therefore have tried to recapture a few of those events. Thank you for joining us for this remembrance of the world at war.
Air transportation provided by British Airways, the world's favorite airline.